Hi, Brooke and Katrine. Welcome to the Radical Therapist podcast.
Hi, Chris.
Hey,
I'm ex-
Chris
I'm
and
excited
Brooke.
to have you both. This is outstanding. In 2023, I did a podcast where I did my favorite therapy book of the year, and it was Designs for the Pluriverse by Arturo Escobar. And not a therapy book, but I made the case for why all therapists should read it. But anyway, so that was kind of my introduction to pluriversal practice. And then somehow your group, your coalition, Courage of Care, came across my radar. I forget how it did
Uh-huh.
now, and saw the work you were doing, and you were very much about pluriversal practice, so that probably caught my attention. And then I think I subscribed to a Substack or
The arrow, yeah.
yeah, the Arrow, and so the Arrow Journal, and your most, which is a journal just for our listeners of wakeful society, culture, and politics.
Mhm.
And your most recent issue was all about pluriversal practice. And both Brooke, and Katrine and Maha wrote a piece to start the journal on one world worlding in our movements, a call and path for pluriversal practice. And I started to read that and got all excited and thought I have to reach out to them and have
Yes.
them come on the show. So thank you for making the time. I appreciate that. And maybe to get started, my first question is really for our listeners. Can you start by explaining the concept of one world worlding and how it limits our ability to imagine alternative futures? How does pluriversal practice or politics offer a counterpoint to that?
Um, yes, I can start off with that question and somehow kind of see if we can narrow it in some way. Um, I think there's two questions here because there's the one world and then there's the one world worlding part, right? So the one world as it appears would be something like the world, the systems we live in, seems like the only viable one, right? It appears as natural, universal, the way we work, think, organize, even the way we sort of move our bodies and feel and relate to each other, um, seems like the way to do it. And of course, this world that we live in, our society is kind of historically contingent, right? It is something that has been created through historical movements, power dynamics, all these things. It's not natural, it's not universal as such, but it appears as such, right? And the worlding part is this active part that we're actually constantly making worlds. Um, and the one worlding um, is also related very much to power, right? Because if you can make something appear as something that's natural or universal, you are very much in power. So the way that the world appears as the one world, as the only world, is often um, in the hands of the people who are in power, right? It serves certain interest, you could say. So I think that's kind of like the most simple way I can frame it. It's this way of how like hegemonic powers kind of world do a process of worlding. Um, but it's also kind of an invisible power. Sometimes we can't point to someone who is actually doing this worlding process. It's something that's going on all the time, right?
Mhm.
Um, I don't know, Brooke, do you have anything here
This is
to
good.
add?
This is good.
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
good.
yeah,
It's like it's almost
yeah.
invisible, and I think that's
Yeah,
part of the power of it too. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it can become super difficult for us to even imagine something else, right? It's like this whole process of living in a system that appears as if it's natural. It's
Yes.
also a way of co-opting almost our ability to imagine something different. because even that imagination is shaped by that worlding process. And of course, that has roots in various historical movements, and very linked to capitalism, colonialism. That has been a way of actually shaping the world into what we see today.
Yeah,
Steve.
thank you for that. And it kind of leads into my next question, because it is hard to imagine oftentimes something very different, even for myself. And in your article, you mentioned that many, and this is, I think, so important in this day and age, and you mentioned that so many social movements replicate the very systems they are trying to dismantle. And what are some, even when we're trying to, our social movements sometimes get caught in that one world, thinking. And what are some of the patterns of domination and oppression that show up even within progressive spaces that you see?
I love this question. I mean, I think many people who are working for whether they call it justice or liberation or healing are probably already pretty aware of some of these patterns. Like they might be looking or trying to catch features, for example, of white supremacy culture, like urgency, perfectionism, binary thinking that already show up, or features of colonialism, like time is linear. And we're, I think, becoming more and more sensitive to catching patterns of exploitation, patterns of dominance, and so forth. And catching them is not quite the same, as you know, Chris, as a practitioner, as then practicing the alternative. So I think there's still this sense of like building a growing awareness. And now we still need to develop and harness more collective power. And then to Katrine's point, I think there's also something maybe more insidious that is sometimes also harder to see, which is that those patterns are one thing that we're being trained to notice more. But there's also a way that that kind of pattern of one worlding can creep in as the background frame, like as if there's one model of liberation. Mm-hmm. And, many different wisdom traditions, spiritual traditions have different models. Some say they all lead to the same place. I don't know. Right. But that we can get locked into this is our vision for the path to liberation, the path to freedom, the path to justice, or this is the way the world should look. I'm imagining many people here probably listening might hold some progressive ideals, but what is the vision of the good life or the good world? Right. Like these are contested still. And I think there can become a way in the search for, ironically, solidarity and collective power that we can default into, like, we need to share the same ideological vision.
For sure.
And that one worlding is really insidious and something we're trying to help ourselves also too. Like we're part of this catch. Yeah.
True. And one of the things why I became excited about your work, and you mentioned this, that like everybody in the article, that everybody's kind of good at naming and diagnosing the problem, but not so much about practicing and embodying alternatives. And I thought that was important. And yeah, so how do we, in this idea of ideological purity and all the stuff that's kind of getting in the way of our movements, and thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, you write that pluriversal practice is an invitation towards deep relationality. Can you elaborate on what that means in practice and how it resists binary thinking?
Okay, this is my favorite thing. Katrine, jump in. And I think this is actually the crux. This is the crux of what we're doing. And Chris, I don't know if you got this feedback, but I feel like in these times, discussions of the pluriverse can feel like some slightly abstract in some way. Like, why are we like we need to build, we need to come together, like we don't need these. And I actually think this is core to the crises of our time. Because I think there's a way of thinking about, and I want to honor my friend, Katie Robinson, who's part of our Courage team, who's like one of the greatest thinkers I've met on this. There's a way of thinking that there's one world and then there are many worlds. So it's either one world or it's the pluriverse. Either we're all connected or we're incoherent. There's order or chaos. And these are some like very common binaries that run through life and run through many of our challenges, right? And then we can see those patterns like replicate in different or along different axes, like me and we, us and them, it's this or that. And I think what pluriversal practice is pointing to is that it's not either or, it's also not the one in many problem, which is a philosophical problem that many traditions try to wrestle with. It's really saying that the key to us coming together is relationality, that to be pluriversal is to be in a live, dynamic relationship with the world around you, to be open to being transformed by the world, to understand that we are part of an interdependent, co-emergent web, that we have agency within that, and we are also inherently and utterly vulnerable within that because we're also impacted by everything in that. So we can build and create our own worlds, but those worlds are always bumping up against being impacted by shaping other worlds. It's this idea of kind of co-emergence. And it's not that we can't find some coherence in that. It's just that there's no ultimate rigidity, fixedness, findability. Like that's the kind of relational frame. And we would say at Courage that catching on to that relational frame is critical for us addressing the crises of our time, which we would diagnose, like many others, we're not saying much new here, as actually relational crises, right? So for us, pluriversal practice is another doorway into reclaiming our relational stance. And if I could just say one more thing, I think there's a way of even thinking about relationship and relationality that we can fall into thinking of relationality even from a one world stance, which is like I'm this atomistic being interacting with you and somehow we're in relationship, therefore this is relationality. That might be some one way of kind of talking and navigating the world, but we're talking about some like real utter interbeing, like complexity that looks different at different levels of scale. And I think that's hard for us to get, but like for me, like this is like the question and practice of my time right now, So
Yeah. Thank you for that. All right. I'm kind of moving into I'm going to kind of invite you into the therapy world a little bit with this next question. How do you see the principles of pluriversal practice aligning with or challenging contemporary therapy models, especially those rooted in individualism and a single dominant psychological framework?
I think jumping off what Brooke was talking about, the relationality, I think that's quite important here because it speaks to also, not that I want to sort of say what human nature is, but move into the field of saying, what are we as humans? We are relational as such, right? So that bringing that element into the therapy room, which in contemporary Western context sometimes is very individualistic, right? Because if you bring the relationality into it in a very intentional way, you're also kind of like pushed into looking at different practices around the different relations that we're part of. So that might be one way of framing it, really looking at what is this human being that's coming into a therapy room, and also looking at how therapy so I live in Copenhagen, right? So therapy is actually, we get it through the welfare system if we're burned out, stress, all these things. But it's still something that is designed for us to be adapting back into the society that we were burned out by, right? Instead of saying, okay, maybe the therapy space even is like a place where you could see these almost disruptive practices moving out of that space. That's not all about kind of making people fit for the system, but actually doing something different with therapy. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that does lead into my next question. Your article critiques how healing modalities are often stripped from their original lineages and sold back to the communities for profit. And I'm wondering how therapists can avoid co-opting cultural healing practice and instead engage in ethical, relational healing work.
Oh, it's such a huge question. I think I want to say, I think many people are trying to do this. I see more and more earnest search and pursuits and respect for lineage and tradition and people. You know, many lineages have been hidden for many people in their training. And if you came up in a Western advanced education system, many of the traditions, many spiritual traditions have been kind of, and the traditions that we receive or are privy to in mainstream circles are also often a certain kind of religious tradition. So I'm really excited by folks refinding those pathways back. And I think that's one thing. And so my background is in religious studies, and there's an important concept, and I'm trying to think of the thinker, a distinction between religious appropriation, and it's not religious borrowing, but it's something along the lines of religious friendship, which is that trying to bring some nuance to this idea that even if this is not the tradition that you were born into, let's say, that many religious traditions have a spirit of friendship, of coming together, of sharing knowledge, of kind of waking or walking each other into liberation or into full humanhood. And what does it look like to, like in pluriversal practice, to learn with and through and be enriched and informed by one another? And so there's a sort of risk in saying this in some spaces because it can sound like total appropriation or kind of an apology for it. But I think there's a kind of, I don't want to lose sight of a natural human hunger to actually encounter the other and not just make that a model or write that off as kind of exploitation, right? There's a way of us wanting to learn and be opened up by many worlds. And I think there's a spirit of that. That's a spirit of humility and being and open to learning literally worldviews that could rock your world. And with that kind of humility and that kind of diligence and that kind of following the leadership of those who steward those traditions and being in right relationship reciprocally with those traditions, I think is a pathway to us doing right healing work and maybe correcting for centuries of not doing that, right? So yeah.
No, that was great. I appreciate how you articulated that. As a Zen Buddhist convert too, and you know, with a teacher and in a lineage, you know, that was very well said. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. You describe lines of flight, and I do like this idea from Deleuze. And these are moments where you write, these are moments where we glimpse alternative ways of being. And I guess my question is, how can therapy help? And the importance of that, like those moments where you can see, you know, maybe different possibilities. But how can therapy help clients recognize and sustain these moments rather than being pulled back into, I know this is a big question too, pulled back into dominant cultural narratives? Yeah.
I think that's not impossible, but it requires sustained practice, right? It requires community where this is seen, mirrored, recognized, and practiced. So one thing is to catch those glimpses that I think we've all had, right? That suddenly there's like, wow, can I actually live from this place in the world? It's a bodily shift almost when you get that glimpse. It can be sort of a creative, felt sense of something else is possible here. But then very quickly we're mirrored back by our surroundings that thing is not possible, right? And we're kind of swallowed back into certain systems, or we're actually mirrored. Oh, that's a great idea. Let's commercialize this, right? So one could sort of wake up to some injustices happening in the community or propose certain strategies, and suddenly it's part of a whole commercialized movement, right? So it's very, very tricky to kind of find those roots out of the system, I think. I do believe in them. I do see that it requires really, really community. You said before, being a Buddhist, also, you know, the notion of having a sangha, so that you don't just, this doesn't just happen, for example, in the therapy room, but you have places to go and practice this where it's welcomed and where it's seen as a creative potential towards something different, if that makes sense. But I do think I think what we've also talked a lot about in courage is as long as we practice certain, norms, shapes in the body, that the same sort of time of practice we need for intentional practice, right? Because we're shaped into something, and in order to kind of reshape ourselves, we just need continuous practice. So it's not something I think done overnight, but through these sort of magical spaces that appears in movements, communities, families, friendships.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, what challenges might, and this is in anybody that wants to kind of lean into pluriversal practice, but what challenges might therapists face when trying to embody a pluriversal approach in a field dominated by Western psychological framework?
Oof, the framework. I mean, back to how Katrine opened, like the frame can become so insidious, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or so background that, we might be aware that, oh, I'm using this particular therapeutic frame, but we're not aware of the background of that frame that's shaping our sense of reality or personhood or freedom. So for me, I love this idea. I mean, I love frameworks, and I love this idea of thinking about what different frameworks open up for us. I'm not a therapist, but I'm a student and recipient of really great IFS training and support. And I love it, internal family systems. And I think it's an incredible model that's in the direction of pluriversal practice. And, maybe depending on the practitioner or thinker. And yet it's a frame. The map is not the territory, as folks say. And so what if, and as we engage with that framework, what other parts or experiences or portals might we not see as a therapist when we're in a framework looking for coherence? And so there's this balance and maybe even a tension between embracing a framework that is skillful enough to help us with a challenge, a distortion, a harm, an issue at hand, right? We get some hold on it or some purchase on it, but to not forget that there might be other things going on here that other frames give us kind of purchase on. And so for me, I think in my experience, the more I encounter and really practice with different frames, some of them are therapeutic, some of them are embodied or trauma-based, some of them are spiritual. I dance in different spiritual traditions. And the challenge is to go deep enough that we understand the frame we're working with and not always try to map, which is what my mind wants to do, the frameworks onto each other. So in pluriversal practice, not everything has to add up. Mm-hmm. Not everything has to make ultimate sense together. We're talking about different layers of complexity and analysis. So that kind of training, which requires a tremendous amount of cognitive flexibility, and I think community, like Katrine, like, are we holding these with a kind of coherence? Feels like such an exciting, direction and movement for us to engage. We're at a time where we have, and maybe there have been times like this before, but with this ability to share information, we're at a time where we can access, play with, receive training, be in community with people steeped in so many traditions and models. Like, that is so enlivening to me, as a practitioner of whatever,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it might also, sorry if I can add, just the fact that you also commit to a frame and use that in a space can bring enormous depth to, I guess, to therapy, but to any work that you're doing. And then the humility that keeps coming up here is, and the willingness of actually learning from with others, and at the same time being rooted in your practice, in your frame, to get somewhere, right? And then refusing the fact to kind of say, okay, my frame is the right one, and I'll model every other frame from that perspective, right? Or I'll extract everything into that frame, but actually saying, okay, this is what I'm good at. This is how I choose to move as a therapist or as a teacher, and then being constantly in dialogue or in solidarity with other frames, and letting us kind of move in that field, I think Instead of saying, okay, let's just step back and not have a frame or be meta about the whole thing, because we're also part of these systems, right? We have to stand somewhere, somehow.
Mhm.
So that sometimes helps me to not just get completely lost in the fear of extracting or of doing the whole one worlding.
Mhm.
So yeah.
I like that idea of like acknowledging and having a frame, right? Some ground to stand on, maybe, and then, but not falling victim, which I do. I mean, to like comparison or like this frame's better than that frame, which
Yeah. Yeah.
I can,
Exactly.
the kind of thing that, which you've been speaking about captures us often. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
okay, this is a question I'm wrestling with a lot right now, and I don't mean to introduce a binary here, but there's often a tension in therapy currently between, because there's a lot of fragmentation happening, but there's often a tension in therapy between accessing shared stories and honoring multiple truths, right? And I'm wondering how you might inform us about how, as therapists, to navigate this responsibility without falling either into rigid absolutism or a kind of detached relativism. Sorry for the binary.
Can I just ask you, Chris? I know that, but so can I just ask you what you mean by having to face this issue um, of being able to be with multiple stories? Because I'm not, yeah, I
Yeah,
would
well, I guess it's like
curious about it.
I think we're kind of getting to this kind of individualistic, like the lack of relationality, and how do we come together relationally through shared stories, which might have been, meta narratives back in the day, but through a lot of the postmodern movement and stuff, there's been a deconstruction of those like ideas around, just the things that used to hold people together, church, all the stuff in some ways. And there's a kind of there's a fragmentation happening. I think some people are being critical about, everything's an acceleration, is maybe what's happening in our culture now. And everything's 3 seconds, there's short form videos, everything's like broken down. There's no narrative is being disrupted in lots of interesting ways. And we're finding it harder and harder to connect with build a bridge with each other, I think. And that's what I mean, maybe when I say shared stories. Yeah.
Mhm.
What do you
I,
think?
I have a like strong embodied sense of that. I don't know if this will be coherent in speaking, but in some ways it feels like the tension between this idea of one world as order and the pluriverse as chaos, right? And this idea of like meta narratives as understandably providing some sense of like what is going on here. Like I long for this too. And then this one sense of the pluriverse in a binary as just kind of all of these different people or communities or cultures having their traditions that can't kind of talk to one another, and how do we then make sense of and navigate. And what I felt in my body was in thinking about, in social media, and you mentioned like this move to quickness, this how does one self, right, like talking at a relative level, find a kind of their own internal kind of coherence or integration or even just steadiness. And that doesn't mean fixedness, but a sense of like, I think you were speaking to this, Katrine, like I know what I'm about right now. Like this isn't everything, this isn't every experience. This is me in this moment in time, maybe in one life, depending on your metaphysics, but like how does this find its own coherence? And I think there's something in me that's pulling more to that part of the question,
Mm-hmm.
which I think good therapists are really good at.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it almost feels like the search for the collective coherence comes from a lack of being able to be in one's own body.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me also strikes me as one of the challenges. Like we're good at naming what's going on here, but not so good at practicing it. So like, what are the pathways into at homeness, okayness, easefulness, groundedness, not this like I'm stuck here, but Katrine has a lot of practices for this. Like, how do I sense my own rootedness, my lineage, what I'm bringing forward, what my path is, whatever language or frame we have for this? How do I sense that while also being open and to the encounter, to being moved by the other? So the sense of rooting and openness, I feel like we're missing. At least I'm in New York too, which is like, I'm feeling the like, how do we come here, right? That feels like the work right now, so much of the work right now.
Yeah, and I think with finding the shared stories, they kind of emerge, post fact sometimes, because sometimes when we want the big shared story and we impose it, it can seem a little bit more forced. And I understand the comfort that leaning into bigger narratives, shared stories. But there's also a trust when we not return, because I don't believe in returning to any kind of like romantic past or something, but when we actually step into new modalities, I think as we're kind of coming into the body, looking at what has been missing, like compensating maybe a little bit for every damage that has been done just through care, like looking at these different practices that points us in another direction will also lead to, I think, broader perspectives, more shared stories, and building these networks also of solidarity between practices and between communities I think also will have this like, will point towards something, but we might not be able to name it right now what these shared stories are. But I think being willing to practice it without having this big full picture of what we're working towards is like the courage that we need, right? And it's really difficult work, but I think that's kind of the beauty in it sometimes also when we throw ourselves at it.
Wonderful, thank you. I guess when I ask, your work calls for an ontological shift and not just a resistance to one world thinking, but an active transformation of how we frame healing and justice. And what would it mean for maybe therapy, but all kind of modes of helping, I would say, what would it mean for it to be truly pluriversal in practice? And maybe I'll add on. Go ahead.
Sorry, Chris. No, I think I'm coming back to this being rooted as, I don't know if we're in the, like we're talking therapy now, but again, like with any work or endeavor, be like choosing to be rooted somewhere, but staying open and humble and in relationship with other practices for the greater good, maybe even, right? To say, okay, not just for what's happening in here, but this practice space has a profound possibility of actually being in dialogue with others, but then again, so that the practice itself doesn't mean that you're, it's like an ontology of the therapy space rather than bringing in multiple practices. And it's a way of staying in dialogue, I would say. Brooke, what do you, that's kind of my intuition, but.
And this is also
I've also just been in therapy, but I'm not a therapist, but I love therapy.
Same. Well, there's a parallel question that we wrestle with a lot at Courage, which is kind of sensing this in movement space or organizations working for healing and justice. And some folks are definitely doing this, but I think there's a call. There's still like what feels like a fundamental dualism that drives a lot of work around justice and healing. And this is kind of what we're talking about, the relational medicine that we need. And the dualism can show up like there's a world out there that's messed up, and I've got to like work really hard to go back and either cope with that world or figure out how to like do something to that world. And there's something about this ontological shift that I think starts to help us sense that we are not in response to or in opposition to that world. We are of the world. You know, that's saying like, what would happen if we realize we are of the same material as the stars. We are of the earth. If we could sense we are that dynamic co-emergence, we're not acting on a world right there. We're actively co-constructing it, which means we have agency to play with it. And I think we're at a time, and hopefully we get there sooner than later, where we can even move from just this idea of fixing the world out there or fighting oppression or healing what's broken within us to starting to channel, harness, transmute some of those energies. There's I think a more playful, creative, dynamic, magical world that can be possible with that ontological shift. That is a very alluring to me, and maybe also hard to see if we're really caught in some of this one worlding that Katrine, I think, so eloquently outlined earlier before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna maybe ask this question, kind of combine a couple questions that I have, and it's just, how can we therapists, which is primarily my audience, how can we, or what would a pluriversal future look like for mental health? And how do you see therapists as potential world builders in their works with those who seek their help?
I mean, what an honor, right? To be a therapist and to be accompanying people in their path of their own world building, integration, healing. And I think that, embodying that frame, or as you're doing, Chris, in your community, is like ushering that relational frame more, is more of a doorway into that, like what we've been speaking of, this possibility of like maybe even unimaginable forms of flourishing and life-giving ways of engaging one another. Like we say a lot in Courage, suffering is not the only reality here. That doesn't mean that there's not suffering. This is not like rainbows and butterflies or bypass, but it's saying like that is here, and there's a whole host of beauty, love, magic, transformation. And I think maybe part of this pull is like clicking for me now is part of a pull for more of that there's just been such a focus, understandably, and also. And so, yeah, that's pulling me as, to everything we've been speaking of, that would require, it feels like, communities of practice that can trust that, not these isolated therapists who are having to struggle to do this on their own, right? But communities of practice that can resist the pull of the institution, which the pull of the institution is pull of accreditation, funding, there's livelihood stuff at stake here. So these communities that can ground in a sense of solidarity, but also in like, okay, like a kind of coherence check. Are we getting this? Are we falling back into those traps? Like I long for that kind of, maybe you already have this, Chris, the pluriversal therapist community. That'd be a great little
That would be great. I think also I'm just sitting here, I'm getting very inspired by this whole like how to bring this into therapy. And I've also been in IFS therapy for some years. And I think just the fact when you meet therapy spaces, communities that are able to integrate many parts of what a human is, like, because then you integrate the community, you understand the societal context, you understand that the human has a body, it's not just cognitive, right? And so if you work in that integrative way, you're kind of, again, you're pushed into looking at various ways of seeing what's in front of you. And then there's also something that comes to mind about authority and decentralizing authority around therapists, because my experience is also that when you meet a therapist that is able to see, to kind of like hold a listening space for you and not have the answers, but actually really rely on the wisdom of the person that's stepping in or the community that the therapist is stepping into. There is an immense amount of healing happening in such spaces, right? And to me, that is pluriversal in its essence, because it decentralizes power within that space as well, which I think is so important.
Yeah, in the frame I work from, narrative therapy, Michael White talked about the role, the stance of the therapist is decentered but influential, and
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think that's
Yeah, and that you understand as a therapist that you are influential, right? That you are also coming with your body, with your mind, with your background into the space, influencing the other person. And you're sitting in front of someone who might be very vulnerable, but really taking that into account as well, is a practice in
you spoke of
itself.
humility earlier too, and I think that's one of those key one of those key challenges, one of those key things through a lot of this work, right? The pluriversal practice. Yeah.
And one of my teachers just said this weekend, I think it's no accident, but we want to be clear about what humility is. Like, not this false humility, like, oh, I don't know anything, right? Like humility with a kind of dignity. Like, I know my stuff and I'm open to being changed, and like really holding that axis, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Okay, we're at the end here, and this is
Yeah.
one of my favorite questions for my guests. I ask it all the time for people that come on. So, very curious what the two of you have to say. But my typical question is, what books, films, thinkers, ideas, what's capturing your attention these days?
We don't have enough time. I'm the biggest nerd. So is Katrine. Okay. I would say for everyone, really, hands down, Leticia Nieto, a therapist, a clinician, an artist, a healer, an embodied practitioner, has done decades of work in theater, in play, wrote the book Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment, which was about helping folks, in a sense, meet in mutuality, which I think is one of the hearts of pluriversal practice. That book specifically was about understanding the impacts of oppression and domination on our shaping and how that shapes what is possible in meeting and how we learn to heal. But the orientation of her work is rooted in love and power and grounded in meeting in that. So hands down that, Leticia, I had to say that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Katrine.
I'm almost jumping in with you there because I'm realizing I'm using her work a lot when I facilitate workshops, because it is really amazing. And I'm like not as nerdy as I usually am, just because I have a lot of work. I have a 4-year-old son. But the book I'm reading at the moment, which I'm interested is within IFS therapy. It's a Danish author. Peter Nielsen, and I'm reading about legacy burdens. So like how generational trauma and these like societal burdens impacts us, and we bring them around, right? And when you get unburdened, which if you've experienced unburdening in IFS therapy, it's such a relief also sometimes realizing that some of the crap you've carried around from conditioning or societal sort of conditioning and wasn't even yours, and I really appreciate that take, and it also does something, I think, for my journey in therapy, that it's not just okay, there's something wrong with me, I have to go and get fixed, but it's kind of like this slow unburdening from certain things. And also realizing some of the burdens are not burdens, but some of the things are good stuff, right? So you also get the oomph of you're seeing the good stuff, what's around you and what you're bringing with you. And that we are just that also, right? We're everything. So that's what I have on my table at the moment. But
Wonderful.
yeah.
Thank you. And for those interested, how would, and I'll link this, but how would people find Courage of Care?
Great. We're at courageofcare.org, and we're the home of relational facilitation training. And last year became the home of the Arrow Journal. So we have a chance now not just to train, but to build a community of folks doing deep thoughtful work around these kinds of issues.
Yeah. Highly recommend, folks. So I will have a link in the show notes. And Brooke and Katrine, thank you for making the time. Tell Maha we missed her, and uh, and so hopefully cross paths with her somewhere down the future. But thank you very much for making the time and sharing with us.
Thank you for these questions and this community you built. It's so great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I'm already a fan. I just came across your work when you invited us into the podcast, but I was like, wow, there's no therapist like this in Copenhagen. So yeah.
Thank you.